PA on the line. I think it was, what was my list here?
Yeah, I'm here. This is John and Mark.
John, you're taking Amy's spot this morning. Thank you very much. And California Air Resources Board, who do we have from there?
Yes, this is Brian Clerico, and I'm substituting for Johnny Raymond.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And Rosheng or someone from SCAG?
Good morning, Dr. Lu. This is Rosheng, myself.
Okay. I toured your offices a couple of weeks ago. You got a really nice place there now.
Thank you. Yes, I like it.
Yeah.
So you're welcome to visit us more often.
It's right across the street from my office. It's about probably, I don't know, 100 yards from the door into your office, your offices from my offices, or less.
Right.
Steve, do we have Bill Quinn or someone from Steve?
Yes, it's Bill Quinn, live from the Global Climate Action Summit.
Have you changed any climate this week, Bill?
We're working on it this week.
Okay.
A lot of people here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would assume so.
So probably it's changed. So it's changed it for the adverse. Everybody's lying.
Yeah. They're all offsetting all of their greenhouse gas emissions this week in San Francisco, right? I'm assuming.
Exactly.
Okay. Opening comments. I've already done my diatribe on hydrogen fueling stations. We should go around the room with self-introductions. We've figured out who's on the phone. Jill?
Good morning, Jill Wynot, South Coast.
Barbara Beard, Chief Deputy Counsel, South Coast.
Philip Crabb, South Coast.
Jackie Brulita, Air Quality Consultants.
Like Carol with Lakeman Watkins for Regulatory Flexibility Group.
Bill Lamar, Executive Director of California Small Business Alliance.
Bridget McCann, LISPA.
David Rothbart, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
Bill Wong with General Counsel's Office. Kurt Coleman, Southern California Air Quality Alliance.
Tyrone Turner, Dakota Communications.
Art Montesano International.
Nan Harold, County of Orange.
Christina Lopez, SCAQMD.
Sarah Reese, South Coast.
Okay. Lots of attorneys surrounding us today. No, that's, I mean, I asked because I wanted, when we talked about indirect source rule, I wanted people to talk about our authority and some other legal issues, so.
They're like nuns, you know, they go in clusters.
Yeah. Someone asked me if I was an attorney, I said no, but I can't shake a stick without hitting one. Okay, the minutes from our last meeting on July 11th. Bill Lamar, our official minute reviewer. Do you have any comments, questions, addenda?
I reviewed them, Dr. Lu, and they look to be in good order.
Okay, anyone else?
I have an issue.
Oh, yes.
I actually had brought up an issue about the website. There's the question that I had asked about the community outreach efforts, which is captured. But there was another issue that I had asked about the website and kind of the opt-in provisions and where to find that on the website. That
I remember
it's
having
very
a
hard.
conversation.
We did
yes.
have a conversation, and there was supposed to actually be follow-up, which never occurred as well. So that's not captured in the minutes.
Okay, so how would we phrase that? Because we have to have kind of some exact wording.
I guess I asked.
What page?
Page 6, the top.
Yeah, the top of page 6.
Asked,
So I asked where to find on the web page because they, moved everything around. Where to find, I call it opt-in, but it's the subscription.
Yeah, yeah. So we
it's-
should say that you also said that it was difficult to locate the subscription pages on the website,
Right.
and that staff committed to
following up.
following up
Right.
and providing that for all of us.
Yeah, and I guess as a follow-up to that, it's obviously hard to find, but I did have to find it because one of the rules that I do participate in as a stakeholder, one of my members got a notice for it and I didn't. And I had been going to the working groups on a regular basis, so then I was like, oh, what's going on? And I had to find it, so I dug through everything, finally did find it. And a lot of the working groups that I was a member of and been participating in, all the boxes have been unchecked, and I don't know why. So I think it's probably important for people to be able to find it pretty easily. For
So
all stakeholders,
Put
not
that
obviously just me.
back on the action item list and share with everyone
Yeah.
where you actually find the subscription page. There are plenty of times where I get a call from someone who's not affiliated with the agency telling me things that I didn't know. So that happens too. But yes, I think that would be good. And I have found the search function on the website to be kind of worse than useless.
Yeah.
You can't find anything using it. I mean, it's just frustrating. But then again, don't ask me about my experiences with phone calls to Citibank about credit cards and things yesterday.
You're just having all kinds of fun.
I was so upset. I felt bad because my children were hearing what I was saying. But that has nothing to do with the minutes. Let's make that correction to the minutes. And any others? Anyone on the phone? Okay, with that correction, we'll deem them approved and not take a vote on them. And move on to agenda item number 3, which is EPA and federal activities. So, John, you want to bring us up to date?
Sure, yeah. Good morning, Dr. Liu, and all the participants in the meeting. Just a few items. There's a fairly big one that a lot of you probably have heard about, what's referred to as the SAFE proposed rule, or the Safer Affordable Fuel Efficient Vehicles proposed rule. And that was signed on August 2nd and published on August 26th. The comment period for that ends on October 23rd. And there will be an event, a hearing on September 24th in Fresno. There's also hearings on September 25th in Dearborn, Michigan, and September 26th in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I heard there may be a 4th hearing too, but I don't think that's been announced yet. So you probably know something about this, but I'll just give you a real 10,000-foot overview. EP proposed to amend the existing CAFE standards, greenhouse gas emission standards for passenger cars, light trucks, and establish new standards covering model years 2021 through 2026. And it's going to have a profound effect on the greenhouse gas emissions. For example, the standards related to that. So there's a lot of information online about it. There's fact sheets. And I wasn't really prepared to give a presentation about it. I'm assuming a lot of you know something about it already. But it is definitely something very important to the state, for sure. And I'm sure CARB and other, a lot of the other people that are concerned about this are evaluating the proposal and probably preparing comments. I don't know what else I can say. I could give you a little bit more detail about it if you'd like.
Is there any chance that 4th hearing is going to be in Los Angeles or maybe even Diamond Bar?
No, there was a Federal Register about it that went out, and I'm pretty sure it's fixed to have that event in Fresno. I don't know if people request having a subsequent hearing. I heard that there's an effort underway to extend the comment period, but I don't know if there'll be a request for more hearings. I mean, if that's important to you, I'm sure you could request that. I don't know how successful you'll be in actually getting that. Yeah.
So
I
Barbara Baird,
go ahead.
I've been in touch with some of the attorneys for the states, California and some of the other states' AG's office. They are going to be requesting both an extension of time as well as a hearing in Los Angeles. And it's likely that we will be doing that as well. But of course, as you've said, whether that's granted is a different question.
Well, I was at a meeting yesterday in which some environmental justice advocates pointed out that when EPA hasn't shown up for hearings in the past, they've gone ahead and held their own. So I don't think that's out of the question either. So we'll figure that out, but to the extent it's possible, I think you can pass along the request. I think the city attorney, Los Angeles city attorney is going to join in that request too, based on the conversation yesterday.
I think you're right.
Okay, what else? Anything else at EPA? As if that's not enough.
Yeah, that was the big one. Let me see. There are a couple more items I wanted to mention. and Barbara and some of the staff are well aware of this, we continue to work closely with them and CARB on processing and acting on the 2016 HMP. We have a notice that's been drafted for the 2006 PM 2.5 serious area plan, and we're hoping to get that signed later this month. And on the ozone parts, we have a aspirational goal of getting that signed, a proposal signed early next year, possibly in January. We continue to work with the state and district on a few issues related to that. And then also even kind of moving into the implementation phase. For example, we're working with the district on MOUs with the ports and airports, and I know Sarah's going to be talking about that a little later today with all of you. Just on a national front, there's the lean effort that's underway led by Henry Darwin, our Chief of Operations, that continues to be unfolding an important part of how EPA is managing its workload. And there's an implementation rule that's coming out related to the 2015 ozone standard. That's not yet final. It's currently at OMB for review, but I'm assuming that will be out fairly soon. So that's on the planning side. On the technology advancement and innovation incentive program side, there's some targeted airshed grant announcement that's supposed to be out very soon. I think it'll be out within the coming weeks, and there'll be up to $40 million available nationwide. And we anticipate South Coast would definitely be a very eligible candidate for some of those funds. So there's staff here at EPA, I think, that are already poised to work with South Coast on that and other parts of California. And then on the DERA front, there's a DERA grant application period that's open right now, but it's for tribal clean diesel funding assistance. And that's actually that program's been extended, the application's been extended April 2019, about $2 million nationwide for that. So if you have any tribes in your area that you'd like to get involved in clean diesel, please let them know if they don't already know. I think that's about it from EPA. Any questions?
Yeah, John, Art, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. I don't know if you or Barbara could answer it. In regards to state policy and versus federal policy, since the states are one of the largest purchasers of fleets of vehicles and such, is there a way for them internally as a legislative body or even local bodies to require certain standards on their vehicles that they purchase to meet those standards, and if the manufacturer doesn't meet those standards, not purchase those vehicles? Because I'm concerned, because as we well know, most of those fleets, large fleets, are located in areas of color, and so those communities that will be impacted through the lack of.
Second, Art. Brian, I know that the governor had that letter that came out about a month ago. Can you talk to that and ARB's public fleet initiative on item 4?
I don't have that information with me this week, but I'd be happy to either, forward that information or bring it next time.
Well, I'm sure there's some of us around the table who know what's going on. Let's talk about under 4, because the governor actually initiated something recently, but it's not.
Yeah, the concern is that
EPA,
there's going to be rollbacks. How do we have, because we're sensing there's a sense, I would say negligence.
Yeah.
And towards certain states, and
yeah.
And if we don't get those things, then we're going to suffer. Our communities are the ones who are going to suffer health-wise.
Yeah.
And that's
Let's talk about that under item 4, Art.
Okay,
we'll
thank you.
bring that up under item 4. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Bill?
Dr. Luke, speak you.
Bill Lamar beat you to the punch. Bill Quinn, second.
Yeah, Brian. This is Bill Lamar. I have a question on page 2. you've got proposed amendments to the mandatory greenhouse gas emissions reporting reg, first hearing of two, wherein you discuss complete and accurate emissions data. Does CARB have any?
We're not on
We're not on CARB,
We're still on EPA.
we're still on EPA.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so just like Art, you're gonna wait until item 4. We're on item 3.
All right.
Okay, Bill Quinn, question for EPA.
Okay, mine is EPA. So I realize this is probably policy coming out of Washington, but John, I wanted to know if you had any information on this proposal to roll back some of the methane regulation. The governor had some very harsh words he said about this yesterday. I just was curious if you heard anything from the region on this.
Is this, you're not talking about vehicles anymore, you're talking about a
No, there's a new one, another one. It's the methane rule that is from the Obama administration, and the president of EPA have announced a planned rollback on that. And the governor starts off his notice as saying this is insane. It borders on criminality.
Bill, thank you for pointing that out. I didn't add that, and I should have. That's something very recent. What I can do is I'll look into it and provide a link to it would be the appropriate contact, so she can share that with everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I guess my question for staff is if the safer rule is adopted as proposed, what does that do for our attainment plans? If we look at that.
So that's something that, Sarah, unless your staff has found out, last time we met, staff was going to look into to what extent, if any, these rules are included in our SIP attainment demonstration. And to the extent they are, then of course we would be short that many more additional funds.
Yeah, you would think in later years as they would kick in that it would have gone into the modeling for mobile source.
It may have gone into the modeling. It's also a question of whether it's been approved into the SIP. A couple years ago, EPA was told by the courts that if they were going to rely on a mobile source measure, they had to not only get a waiver or grant a waiver, but also approve the rule into the SIP. It's our thought that if it is in the SIP, then we could have a stronger argument against preemption based on the same theories that we're using in the railroad litigation.
So I'm sure that will find issue, if relevant, will find its way into your comments, which will be submitted prior to October 23rd.
Right.
Okay. All right, great. That's helpful. Any other questions? Anyone else? Any members of the public? None? Okay. Then we can move on to item number 4. Brian? Whoops.
Hi, yes, thank you. Good morning, Dr. Liu and the other members there. My name is Brian Clerico, and I'm a sort of substituting for Johnny Raymond. There might be a transition here where I'm the person who more regularly does these updates. My background's in stationary source permitting with a local air district, so I'm still getting up to speed on a lot of the mobile source and house gas issues here. So, but what I thought I'd do, I could pass along my phone number here, and any questions you have for any of the items I mentioned, or just anything that ARB is involved with, I'd be happy to follow up with you and get you the answer. You can reach me at 916-327-7843. So with that, I'll just go down a short list here of items I thought I'd bring up. One, Bill Quinn had mentioned already, the Global Climate Action Summit's going on today through Friday at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. And of course, it's a showcase for the states and regional, local governments, companies, investors, and such. The measures they've taken to date to reduce greenhouse gases, and then also to hopefully secure commitments for further reductions and show that there's the national government, that there's a broad support for action on climate change. Related to that, Governor Brown just signed Senate Bill 100, committing California to 100% renewable, zero-emission electricity, plus carbon neutrality by 2045. And at present, according to the California Public Utility Commission, we're at about, at least three of the large utilities are at 42% renewables. So we're making a lot of progress in that area. As far as the CARB control calendar there, now, as you know, a lot of these items on here, they're tentative. The calendar isn't finalized until about 10 days before the actual meeting. So, but one item on there almost assuredly that'll be addressed would be the amendments to the low carbon fuel standard, and those areas being amended are outlined on the calendar, and I won't repeat those. You can see those for yourself. I'd be happy to find out any more information about that if you'd like. There will be a public workshop on proposed amendments to the diesel particulate matter control measure for solid waste collection vehicles. And that workshop, or one of them, will be held in South Coast at the headquarters there on September 21st, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. So if you have any interest in that, that'll be a local workshop you can attend or figure out how to tune in for. A couple of other items here I thought of interest to South Coast, that CARB has selected 2 Los Angeles County communities for the study of neighborhood air near petroleum sources. Goes by the acronym of SNAPS. And those 2 communities are Baldwin Hills, the Inglewood oil field, and in South Los Angeles, the Las Ciennegas oil field. So the SNAPS program there, the plan is to conduct a 3 to 4 month air monitoring study in each of those areas, and then monitoring toxic air contaminants, criteria pollutants, metals, the sort of usual suspects there, methane, and then of course to have community meetings to get hear the concerns of local residents, discuss results. Some of those results, I believe, for the criteria pollutants will be available real time, so those can be, those will be readily accessible as well, and then also to discuss any further actions as a result of what we learned from the monitoring.
Do you know if
I
there'll
believe
be
South Coast
inventory assessment too, or is it just going to be monitoring?
I think this is it's focused on monitoring. I don't know that it'll be, there'll be
I'm just curious because of the use of the diesel generators for various activities. I was wondering what the...
Yeah, that'll be interesting when for the monitoring and what in terms that they have identified certain whatever spikes or high levels of pollutants, and tracing those back to specific sources. I'm sure that will be a consideration as well. And then lastly, I was just going to mention these Clean Vehicle Assistant Program that CARB through its climate investments has funded or launched with a $5 million grant. This is to provide hybrid and electric vehicles to low-income houses. Will provide them to help them pay for those vehicles. I think they're anywhere, the grants are $2,500 to $5,000, depending on if it's a hybrid or an electric vehicle. And the program eligibility requirements are spelled out on the Clean Vehicle Assistance. There's a website people can go to, and there's of course, I can find out more information for you if you'd like about that. Are there any questions on those items or other items you'd like me to?
We had two questions from the last item. One was about the governor's public fleet. You said you didn't have that information handy, so we can talk about that separately. And then, Bill Lamar, you had a question about the greenhouse gas reporting requirement.
Yeah, I guess the reason I got confused was some of you were calling Johnny Brian and Brian Johnny. So, anyway, Brian, on page 2, under the proposed amendments to the mandatory greenhouse gas emissions reporting regulation, where you're striving for complete and accurate emissions data, has CARB, and I'm sure they have, any plans in progress to try to investigate and determine the impact that these forest fires have had on California in terms of emissions, and what that's going to do, its potential impact on our attainment goals and everything else?
I don't know. I'm sure there's been. I can speak to someone in the monitoring group about that. Yeah, I'm sure it's a big issue. I mean, obviously, yeah. We have so many areas of the state that are non-attainment for PM 2.5, particularly, and that's not helping matters. I mean, I know there's an extraordinary events, or what they call it, exclusion for some of these, but yeah, this has been kind of a sustained, problem for the past few years. So, but yeah, I'll find out for you what's up with that.
Yeah, because we're going to have emissions releases for a long time, and with I don't know how many structures were burned. I mean, there's varnishes and paint and just all sorts of toxics and criteria pollutants that I hate to see industry have to see some ratcheting down for this type of event.
Right, I understand.
Well, I'm actually curious.
Yes, I'll see what I can find out for you there and get back to you here as soon as I can.
Now, you mentioned it, Bill. That's actually a pretty interesting question in that you see even with the Purple Air network, you see the PM 2.5 levels spiking near the fires. But what I don't think I've seen discussed is if there are gaseous emissions associated with that then turn into particles that then turn into smog eventually too. In addition to that, so there are certainly a lot of inventory type questions that go along with that, and then requirements, because if we do have fire season, 10 months out of the year, every year, then it's no longer an extraordinary event. But I don't know how we're supposed to control for it. Right?
I don't know. Yeah. I saw a news piece on PBS this past week where I think it was a component of UC Davis, and they had a couple of vehicles out there doing monitoring, electric vehicles with the monitoring device on each one, measuring the pollutants that are still prevalent there, because people are moving back in there. I mean, there's construction going on.
Last week up in Northern California, I looked at the statewide Purple Air network, and there were several monitors that were in the 600 range on the AQ index. I mean, it was just off the charts where the fires were. So, Art, this is what I know about what's going on with public and private fleets statewide, is that the governor sent a letter to the Air Resources Board, and right after the president signed, the EPA published this thing in the Federal Register saying that they were going to go after California's waiver and also freeze the mileage standards. Governor Brown sent a letter to the Air Resources Board saying, I want you to look at adopting regulations for public fleets and private fleets in California, basically from the smallest vehicle to the largest. And the Air Resources Board then scheduled a workshop that was held, I think, on the 29th or something last month. They had that workshop, and they are proceeding with rule-making process. I think there's some information on the Air Resources Board website on the issue, and I would assume that someone here on staff is paying attention to it. So why don't we see if we can get someone to...
Could, Dr. Liu, since you're one of his appointees, and could they expand to look at, because going back to what Bill is saying, and you're looking at the emissions and locality of those things, since you're gonna ID those fleets, whether they be public or private, and since we now can GPS where any package is in the world, I think it would be ideal for us from a scientific standpoint and also from a litigation standpoint to see that when we have those monitoring stations and those fleets, where those fleets are located and where they're located close to communities of color, because I'm looking at it from an advocate on the litigant side of those communities to be able to say, look, as a class, these rollbacks are going to have an adverse effect on, especially on the elderly, the children, school sites, because now as we have the ability to locate those sites along with monitoring the air and then monitoring, I don't know how you monitor negligence or stupidity in regards to the truths and untruths, but at least we can at least see what the impact is of those types of decisions. And I think those are something that from our community that we have. And, you know, I come from a county that is a lot of times is negligent in doing that.
Yeah, and it's a good question. I don't understand when we do inventories for mobile sources, we rely on a very complicated computer program, MFAC, which is that the Air Resources Board does. But that's, I don't even know how it's broken down geographically. It's certainly not by roadway, right? I mean, there's different...
No, but they got to start up the fleets every morning, right? So
yeah.
When you start up all those diesels, it's no different when I look at the Bay Area, when we look at, you know, the largest emissions of is the rail lines.
It's a little piecemeal now. I mean, if you propose a project, you then estimate what the vehicle counts will be and what the impacts will be from that and mitigate them if necessary or you know, go through the CEQA process on that. But overall, I mean, Caltrans does vehicle counts, right? And they've got plenty of cameras out there looking at those things, but I'm not sure if people are taking a look at the issue of what you're saying. Like,
well,
is there an environmental justice disproportionate impact issue just with fleets and vehicles? I'm assuming so, but I don't remember.
So I don't want to make any assumptions because I think we're already making a lot of assumptions when policies are occurring now. I'd rather look at the facts, and then see how do we mitigate that.
I'm just trying to figure out who has that information. I don't believe, yeah, Barbara's got it.
Well, I know, and probably I should defer to Ramshang, but when SCAG does the regional transportation plan, they do look at environmental justice impacts of what they expect to see in the future in terms of the regional transportation network. And also SCAG provides trip information for the AQMP, but I don't know how detailed either of those information.
Yeah, in terms of geographic specificity. But Ramshang, if we look at it was with 2016, right? Regional transportation plan, will we find that information in it?
Yes, the travel active data, actually we have a specific road type kind of information, you know, freeway, roadway, local streets, etc. So we do have those kind of data information. And also as part of our RTPSS, the Regional Transportation Plan, Sustainable Community Strategies, we have an appendix on the and the environmental justice analysis. So that also has a lot of information about the impact.
Now, is there a way to, because I don't want to go into some of the things that Bill has raised, those communities of color usually are located right next to where the factories are and such. So we have the stationary source and we have the mobile source. So there's a way to differentiate which is which, so then you don't have an impact on one where, because in those same areas, we got the power plants, we got the fleets, we got industry. So, which is the culprit, or is it all three, or is it the perfect storm?
And one thing that I don't think that Brian brought up too is this AB 617 implementation that's coming up on the 27th at the Air Resources Board. They're gonna, there's proposed communities, this document here that, I don't know if everyone got it, where they have the proposed communities, 3 in the South Coast. But this is the very thing that the monitoring and the inventory and the emission reduction plans are supposed to come out of the implementation of AB 617, which is now called what's it called, Clean Air, Community Air Protection Program.
Who's the author of that?
It's the CARB staff.
Yeah, it's the CARB staff.
Okay.
And it's going to be, so if you have a chance to check the webcast or something on the 27th, it might be a pretty interesting conversation. Where they're going to identify those communities and vote on which ones that we get to focus on. I would assume they're the ones that are proposed, but we'll see how that decision goes. But this is the very thing I think that's going to go into figuring out how to improve conditions in these disadvantaged communities that were specified through this new law. And a lot of that's going to be our responsibility to try to figure out. So
Yeah, because
they're right on the cutting edge of some things that are going to be happening very soon.
Yeah, because if you look at LA and the urban layout, it's hard to monitor like downtown. But if you look at Orange County and you look at Santa Ana and you look at where some of the fleets are and you look at South County, then you have some clear geographic differences where you can monitor, and some of the stuff may not be skewed by other elements. So I think those are things that we need to look at statewide.
Yeah.
So I would leave, you did bring up MFAC, and at least where I work, we use it periodically, and that's just throughout the state. It's not going to get narrowed down to a specific fleet, which is an interesting 617 issue as far as if you're using an inventory, how do you really quantify those emissions in certain areas? And I don't think there is a way right now.
Yeah. I mean, vehicle counts and things.
Right.
And then make assumptions. You make assumptions about
right. State fleet. Well, the dirty ones are down here, and the cleaner ones are in the northern part of the state. The average is correct.
Yeah.
But where are those trucks?
But if you're going to regulate private industry, shouldn't you take care of your own house first? And so I think those are the things that you can't say, the feds are not making correct decisions and, blast them on TV and everything else when you're not even willing to clean your own house.
So we do have some fleet rules, and they're a little bit old at this point, and we attempted to go to the legislature to update our authority and got pretty much nowhere. So we will be going back to the legislature, I believe, to try to move that again, to update our authority so we can go back and actually clean up our own house to the extent that we have the authority to do so. But at the same time, it looks now like the Air Resources Board is going to be moving forward. So we'll have to make sure that, and this is a good home rule issue, that the two things aren't duplicative.
I just want to make sure that they get those concerns because, sometimes I keep saying those boards don't look like what the state looks like, demographic.
Yes. Okay. Although it's my understanding that Diane Tagorian, a prominent environmental justice advocate, has been reappointed to the California Air Resources Board and will be at the 27th hearing. So that's kind of interesting too. So yes, check the ARB website. If you want to take a look at the SCAG, Regional Transportation Plan and Sustainable Cities appendix, that might be good source of information. And then follow this AB 617 implementation as we actually get into communities and try to figure it out. You never ask easy questions, do you?
Well, I mean, we got some of the top lawyers here, and we're trying to look at something, because we want to keep jobs in those areas, whether it be in the valley and other areas. And I'm not gonna pound on industry if we're not regulating our own selves. And then the technology needs to exist. We all need to exist in an environment where we all can work in clean jobs and clean areas. And our communities are working with industry to bring those type of jobs here and work with those industries. But I think those that are responsible for making governance and public policy also have a moral responsibility. You just can't blast the idiots in DC for what they're not doing are not the truth and facts. When you have the ability to do it here locally, and which is worse.
Yeah.
Because
So I think,
you're painting
I
yourself
would
as
say
the
that I believe
apostle.
that the governor's initiative was in direct response to that and was actually.
But actions speak louder than anything else.
Those are actions. Believe me, the Air Resources Board.
Those are words. Until I see the
Air
action,
Resources Board will be adopting regulations.
They're empty words.
There will be adopting regulations on both private fleets and public fleets, and they've started the process to do so now. So that's happening. Any other questions or comments on the item 4, the CARB regulatory activities update? Any members of the public?
Dr. Lulu,
yes.
This is Rongshan. I have a quick question on the SNAP program. Hi, Brian. Is SNAP part of the AB 617, and how are they related?
I don't think it is formally part of 617. It sort of happens to complement, though, the goals of 617. But
I see. And as you are aware, the AB 617 has several elements. One of those is after the monitoring, we have the mitigation plans. And will the SNAP program have a similar thing after the monitoring? There will be some kind of a mitigation plan being developed as a result of the reporting?
What I've seen of the SNAP program, and I can also follow up there to make sure, but it does look like they have a similar approach to, mitigating any potential problems there. So there, it starts with, possibly just enforcing permit, maybe that if they identify a problem, leaks or whatever, and then it goes to all the way up to, I think, possibly, potential mitigation measures.
Okay, thank you.
This is Jill Wynot. I just want to point out that ARB adopted an oil and gas regulation fairly recently, and we were working on one here at South Coast, but we put ours aside because the ARB reg pretty much covered what we were going to be doing locally as well. So there are regulations in place, and I think this is just some follow-up to see if there are leaks or, if they have a good understanding of the emissions. And it could lead to additional changes later, but I think we have to do the monitoring and see what it says.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
And thanks, Brian, for the update. If no other questions, we'll move on to item 5, legislative update with Philip. Anything happen in the legislature?
Just a little bit, well, first of all, just to clarify, this month's legislative committee meeting is actually on Friday, September 14th, so I can't report on the meeting itself. But the agenda will have 2 primary items, and first there'll be an end-of-the-year summary report on the state legislature and the governor's actions for 2018, and there's a small preview to that. In Sacramento, the state legislature adjourned on August 31st for the 2018 legislative year. State Assembly and Senate combined introduced over 2,600 bills in 2018 and sent over 1,500 to the governor for his consideration. The bills to the governor do include some of the leftover 2-year bills from 2017, and any bills that did not make it to the governor's desk are now dead. And the governor now has until September 30th to sign into law or veto all the bills that have been sent to him for 2018, and any bills that are not acted on by the governor actually will also become law. Just a little trivia, usually when I ask people that, they're 50-50 on what they think will happen. Specifically for the South Coast region, this was a successful legislative year in several ways, including but not limited to securing $50 million in statewide funding for local air districts. to support implementation of AB 617 requirements, and this is an increase from last year's funding level of $27 million. Also, the securing of $245 million in statewide funding to local air districts for incentives to help accelerate turnover to clean vehicles in support of the AQMP. Also, AQMD's sponsored bill, SB 1502, was signed into law by the governor and allows local air districts to provide more modern forms of public notice, such as through electronic email, and also the securing of key amendments to SB 1260 by Senator Jackson, which is an omnibus fire prevention and forestry management bill that's still pending before the governor, and would allow AQMD to permit mechanized burner equipment in LA County that provides for cleaner controlled open burns. The second item on the legislative committee agenda will be discussing a new public survey that is being developed relating to a potential sales tax increase ballot measure for air quality funding. The governing board approved this as a legislative concept to pursue this past Friday. And that's my report.
Okay, questions, comments?
Philip? Go ahead. A question on this survey. Would you clarify, what are you going to do then? You have the authority from the governing board to seek an author, right?
Legislative authorization.
Yeah.
It's a bill that would authorize a ballot measure.
So that's what you're moving forward on?
We've been directed by the board as of Friday, basically to explore.
You don't have it done yet?
Concept. What's that?
You don't have it done yet?
No, we're waiting for them to come back in session.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so you're trying to find, you're looking for an author now, and then someone who will draft this piece of legislation.
Yeah, I mean, obviously lots of preparation for this bill would include that too.
Right.
Yeah.
It seems to me that because everything has to be approved by the governing board, or at least by the legislative committee, we're never in a really good position when it comes to end of session, because we can't react as quickly as we need to sometimes. And so there was a bill, I think it's SB 715, Delgado, the woman who's only going to be in the legislature for a few weeks, sailed through diesel exemption bill for certain diesel trucks that are used for training drivers, is now before the governor. And we haven't had a chance to even take a position on it. You would think that a bill like that is not really in our interest. And I don't know if it's going to be signed or vetoed before Friday, but you might want to put it on the agenda to take a position on it, because it sets a very bad precedent, and it was pretty odd gut and amend circumstances for that. Are you familiar with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think CAPCOA has kind of taken the lead in terms of opposition. So, yeah, exactly. I mean, we have a process.
So the bigger picture thing is, I don't know, I mean, maybe we should schedule ledge committee meetings, special ledge committee meetings, you know, the last week of session before the deadline. You know, they now have, what, a 72-hour deadline. So we know when all those things are going to happen. But we also aren't in a position where we can actually discuss or take positions on things sometimes when, and this one, you know, it's not going to be the difference between attainment and non-attainment, but it sets a precedent, and it's a pretty bad bill for air quality issues. But it's happened in other years too, where things happen really quickly in Sacramento. And I remember with Barry Wallerstein, we always had that kind of conversation. He said, well, you know, I feel like I've got enough authorization to do this, but not that. And he was always trying to have to split hairs with, you know, how much, you know, how loose or tight the leash was on what he could do in Sacramento during the last weeks of session. Anyway, David.
Question, sort of parallel subject as far as, you know, what you're pursuing. At least folks I represent on the biogas side, there was SB 1440. I don't remember if AQMD took a position on that.
No.
The reason I bring it up is, as far as biogas folks have been saying for quite a while, we need incentives to do something with the gas when we put in the pipeline, and financially there isn't a lot of money being directed towards that gas that's being produced no matter what. It's a part of an essential public service. You generate the gas for digestion of waste, and you have this gas that could be a really good fuel that's low carbon intensity, but yet when we have asked for support, I haven't seen them follow through. So I was curious if there's been direction to say, hey, this is something we should be working in that
So that
direction.
one was tied up with the geothermal too? Yeah. I don't remember if that one came up, but I don't know how you, I mean, there's thousands of bills, right, to consider. So I don't know how you prioritize, and you obviously can't go through 100 bills with the committee. You can go through a handful.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of changes that can happen in the last couple of weeks. of
Yeah, and that
session.
one was complicated because of the geothermal and the biogas components.
Right.
I don't know how you do it.
It's a team effort.
Yeah, and you just have to prioritize, I mean, what the highest priorities are. Okay, other questions on legislative updates, comments, anyone on the phone? Any members of the public, anywhere? Not exercising your First Amendment rights, here, people. Okay, that gives us to item number 6, which is update on litigation and related items. I guess, Bill, you're gonna do that?
Yes, right here.
I know, normally you're here, but Sarah's
and
always.
we're moving around. I think Dr. Liu, actually, there's not much happening with the courts as opposed to the legislature, so there's really not much in terms of updates. I don't know, Barbara, if you're willing to, I don't know what's happening with the reclaim lawsuit. I know that we had indicated possibility of settlement. We met with the board, and I don't know if there's anything you can share on that.
Both sides are discussing the possibility of staying the litigation for about a year and a half or so to see how the reclaim landing rules and the other reclaim amendments that we'll be making over the next year and a half shake out, in the hopes of not having to go through a further hearing on whether 14 tons or 12 tons was the right number back in 2015. So we'll probably be reporting on that next month.
We can't talk about what happens in closed session, but you can just imagine how many people really want to have another one of those hearings.
You can do that with 1469 back to back.
Thanks, Kurt. Bring it back up. Yeah, that was a great idea. There'd be a lot of happy people in the audience. Okay, any other questions or comments on people who are suing us or we're suing? No one else? No members of the public? Okay, that gets us to facility-based measures, which we didn't plan it, but it just turned out that we just got enough, so basically the same PowerPoint presentation on Friday and
Almost
some conversation.
identical.
Yeah, almost identical. I started to look for differences, and I thought, you know, it's close enough to be the same thing. So for those of you who were at the governing board meeting on Friday, we kind of had the conversation, but some issues did come up, so we can talk about those too. And I guess, Sarah, you're going to take the lead on this?
Yeah, so just wanted to give you guys an update on the work that we've been doing pursuant to the direction received from the board back in May. Just real quick, this is a recap of kind of high level of what board direction was for each of the 5 facility-based measures. And I'm going to get into a little bit more detail of those as I go through the PowerPoint. But you can see it starts off with the airports and ports, more focused on MOUs and voluntary actions. And then as you go down the list, we look more towards regulatory actions and developing indirect source rules. So for airports, we received a clear direction to work with them to develop MOUs. MOUs would be with each of the airports. The MOUs would effectively encapsulate the clean air action plans that we're asking each of the airports to develop, and they're currently working on that pretty actively. We would then be giving regular updates back to the board to see on status. You know, in the event that we weren't feeling we were making sufficient progress on those MOUs, we would then come back and ask for authority to pursue regulatory action. We've had very good discussions with the airports so far. They're all, as I mentioned, all working to develop clean air action plans right now. We've shared a draft MOU framework with them and are working on getting comments back on that. We've also offered to help them in developing the inventory baseline and forecast, as well as evaluation of different control strategies and what emission reductions we think we'll get out of that. So ongoing work with the airports, so far it's proceeding pretty well, and we'll continue down that path.
Can I ask a question before we move
Sure.
on from airport? Which airports are covered by this?
So it's the 4 major airports here, so it's Los Angeles, Burbank, John Wayne, and Ontario.
Okay.
Sarah, I think there's, that, I mean.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be 5 airports.
Van Nuys?
Burbank, Long Beach, John Wayne, LAX, Ontario.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, but not the commuter, like, not Dan Ives,
Not
Whitman,
Santa Monica.
Hawthorne.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, not the smaller ones.
Right.
So on ports, we also got the direction to pursue an MOU in lieu of an ISR. The ports have already developed a clean air action plan, so the concept here is that the MOU would take specific elements of the clean air action plan, develop some targets, performance targets or emission reduction targets out of those, and then that would be what we would agree to pursue in the MOU. Again, regular progress reports back to the governing board. We're also looking at exploring new incentive strategies for cleaner ocean-going vessels that will be visiting our ports, as ocean-going vessels contribute very significantly to NOx in the basin. And then again, if the MOU process is not successful, we would be returning to the board seeking permission.
There was a trip to China, right?
There was a trip to China.
How did that go?
Very well.
And
exhausting.
Exhausting, yeah.
Yes. But no, we went to China. We spoke with several folks in Hong Kong, also in Shanghai and Beijing about the concept of working together to have an incentive program on cleaner vessels, and it was very well received.
For the
Pacific Rim, yeah.
Rim ports.
So in terms of our update, we have started talking with the ports about what an MOU framework would look like. The framework for us, at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're going to get SIP credits for emission reductions received. And so that puts on certain, restrictions or characteristics of the MOU. We, as I mentioned, want the ports to be able to commit to specific measures within their cap and get emission reductions from that. We think that there are some measures that we can look at that are both reasonable, technically feasible, and achievable. Definitely want to be able to make sure that the ports maintain their ability to get funding, and then they also have a public process for any MOU development. The way the MOU would work is that the ports would have the contractual agreement with us, SCAQMD. In the event that they're somehow unable to meet the emission reduction targets that we would agree to in the MOU, it would be on SCAQMD to backstop that and then to go get those residual emission reductions.
Now we're the backstop?
Where?
That's flipped 180 degrees, hasn't it?
So in terms of where we are, ports that I've mentioned, we've had some initial discussions. Port staff have raised some concerns with the MOU approach. Initially, they want to have a broader interagency process, so they want to have EPA and CARB involved in not only developing the MOU, but actually as co-signatories to the MOU. We have some concerns with that, one on timing, as we're moving on a fairly fast track to get an MOU in place in order to get, ideally, credits that we can then take in our SIP. And to do that, we need that in place probably in a year or two time frame. They've also expressed probably the bigger concern is in terms of being able to get emission reductions out of specific cap elements. And the concern is that they don't necessarily control the number of trucks or different behaviors that happen at the ports, and so are concerned about being able to actually make those commitments. That's a bigger problem for us, as we need to be able to figure out ways in which we can get emission reductions, quantify them, meet SIP integrity elements with EPA. So we're in the middle of still working with the ports on this. I think we'll reach resolution at the end of the day. We just need to have continuing discussions, and we'll keep everybody posted. For new development and redevelopment projects, we were directed to continue working with the existing working group to develop emission reduction strategies and think about what potential rule concepts could look like. But there were a lot of concerns raised about the scope of projects that would be involved, the types of projects, whether, for example, if affordable housing projects would be involved, what some of the economic impacts would be, and particularly concerns on real estate costs and job and economic impacts. So we've met with the working group again, and we've talked about all of these concerns and issues. The working group has requested that we pursue a study to help address the concerns that the board raised. So a bit more of an economic impact study. We'll be looking to do that, to issue an RFP to conduct that study. And then again, coming back to the Global Source Committee as well as our governing board to give updates.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
To the extent you know just off the top of your head, I don't need a comprehensive list, but who are the major members of the working group from the development community?
from the development, I mean, we have folks representing different, well, I guess there's a little bit of an overlap with our warehouse working group, as well as folks from the major real estate and entities.
Your clients haven't been calling you? Would assume they would.
So where we are with warehouses, we did receive direction to start rulemaking activities in this area. But again, a lot of issues are raised in terms of concerns about job impacts, economic impacts, impacts on commercial real estate costs. There's some technological feasibility issues. So we were asked specifically by the board to pursue an economic impact study. At the same time, asked to continue exploring the non-regulatory options that could be available, including a new CEQA air quality mitigation fund. It's a warehouse guidance document that CARB is looking at developing, and then also perhaps pursuing some green delivery concepts. We've had 2 working group meetings so far with warehouses. We've discussed potential concepts of what an indirect source rule would look like. We also had a follow-up discussion specifically on CEQA Air Quality Mitigation Fund. Spending a lot of time right now better understanding the business models for warehouses, understanding what the contractual relationships are between the warehouses and the trucks that are making those deliveries. Feel we need to get a better understanding of that in order to be able to craft regulatory options that make some sense. And then we're also pursuing this RFP for an economic impact study. We discussed this with the board last Friday, and we'll be proceeding with that. For rail yards, we were given fairly specific direction to pursue regulatory action. It's important to note here that any indirect source rule that we pursue in this area will need to be able to harmonize with federal requirements, so there's an additional layer that we would have to go through. At the same time, we're not closing the door on potential voluntary actions, and so we'll still be looking to see if there's other agreements we might be able to make that go beyond the existing 1998 and 2005 MOUs. We're tentatively looking at an upcoming working group meeting later on this fall. Right now, we're spending a bunch of time setting up site visits and better understanding, again, what the state of play is with rail yards. Still keeping abreast of what CARB is doing in this space, and then also looking at specific emission inventories. And one thing to note here is there's some initial concepts for voluntary actions that we could take. Might be a little similar to the warehouses, where there could be something we could do with, for example, a fleet certification program associated with the trucks that would be visiting rail yards. So that's kind of a brief update. Very happy to answer any questions.
Art has a question.
I want to comment. I like the idea of you looking at the. A lot of times you can't do things because you have contractual obligations, and you've got a lot of players at the yard, and you've got a lot of individual contracts with people moving a lot of the materials. Years ago, SCAQMD developed a special engine that you guys were working with in a program with the fleets in regards to the lower emissions type of engines that you guys were going to implement.
There's been several efforts on that.
Yeah,
and was the one you were referring to, the low NOx, near zero emission?
Yeah. Oh, well, the different programs that you guys had worked with industry in a joint effort to work with them with technology, and not just put a regulatory burden on them, but also see how you can work on both ends to see what's feasible, because you can't regulate something and not have certain expectations without the technology out there to make it real. Has there been any studies or follow-up to see what the length of, by the time it becomes a policy from the board, to it gets implemented, to the time it hits the street, and to the time you get the feedback? Because you can make regulations and such a policy, but not see the impact a year later. And from a taxpayer, because I know when we look at it from the school side, we look at implementing policy for kids, and then we see a growth rate under test scores or whatever. How do you look at that making an impact so then you can create the type of policies to mitigate those issues and then come back with solutions that are feasible. So yeah, I think if you can look at that and then come back to us to see what would be what's workable and what's not workable. Because you're gonna have to go back and you have to come back to those boards, say this is what we implement. We found these are the type of programs that work with industry, because it's industry that's gonna make the change at the end. And they're the ones that gotta make the investment, and they gotta see if it's economically feasible also. So I would just recommend that if we could see what you spend the money, you might as well look and see what, if you hit the target or not.
Well, we're trying to raise the money to help offset the costs, and we're trying to develop the policies.
But if you can quantify the results and see, well, and everything doesn't work. I mean, some things fail like anything else.
And technology's at a certain stage today, and it'll be at a certain place tomorrow. So yeah, we're considering all those issues. I didn't see who got up first, David or Bill? David. Okay.
Beat me up by a nanosecond.
We can maybe go to instant replay, try to figure that out.
Question on kind of bigger picture as far as the mobile source strategy and direct source rules. I think this all came out of the 2016 AQMD. And I've heard Dr. Liu ask this question, and I haven't seen kind of a response as far as where are we in trying to respond to our goal in 2016 AQMD. You said we need so many tons per day reduction to hit the 2023 requirements for attainment. And it'd be nice to have a running total of kind of how we're doing. I haven't really seen that. We have a lot of moving pieces, and I'm kind of curious how we're doing tracking towards our goal.
You're right.
Suspicion.
You're right, though, there's a lot of moving pieces, and it's part of the activity that we're doing right now with facility-based, right, is that we're thinking about, we spent a year going into it to evaluate whether to pursue regulatory actions, to make recommendations of what to do. Now we're starting the work of implementing that and executing it. So it'll take a while for that to filter down and to get that in place. At the same time, we continue our regulatory actions on stationary sources as well. But we know that the bulk of the emissions are from mobile sources, and that's really where we need to focus.
And I assume carbon EPA is really, or CARB's taking on the heavy load of what reductions have been committed to.
There's definitely that, and then of course with EPA we have to be cognizant of whatever rollbacks they have and what impacts that'll have with us too.
And kind of a fear I have is if we don't get to attainment, we're back to, okay, federal government saying, okay, you're not in attainment, and now we have penalties, and going through that whole process.
And here's your fifth.
They should do that. That would be very interesting to see if they would do that.
Well, they could be forced to do it, even if they don't want to.
Is Section 185 penalties was something that Bill Lamar and I had. It'd be nice to.
It's Bill's favorite topic, Section 185.
We could go back to DC and talk to folks, but it'd be nice to preempt that if possible.
Yeah, and I'm kind of afraid to look. I mean, how many tons do we need per day? 150, was it?
Lots.
Was it? I mean, it's 2023, I think it was 150. 150 tons per day, and I don't think we've made a dent. And certainly not a significant one yet. And we were estimated we needed at least $1 billion a year, and now we're saying perhaps more. And we've gotten a few hundred million. So I think we're a little bit behind the ball on this.
But it's also a reason why we've been advocating with EPA and others for the need for a new heavy-duty NOx standard, and is doing a lot of work for that.
Yeah.
And like that's really where we would get a big bang for the buck in terms of
Not getting it by 2023, but by 2030,
Right.
maybe 2030, something. Yes.
Right.
It's just more.
But it has to happen. I mean,
Right.
If we foresee we're not going to attain to look at the unintended consequences again, and just say, Section 185, if we know that's going to happen, is there a way to start dealing with that politically?
That's a really good question. We should probably start thinking about that. Yeah.
I haven't thrown away any of my.
Your 185 files?
185 files.
Still there?
I remember sitting in a room with Henry Waxman, and I'm paraphrasing him where he says, I understand that my act is having some unintended consequences. And boy, I tell you, I will remember those words forever. if this comes around again.
And you did a good job paraphrasing, I was there too.
And he promptly retired. All right, Bill, you didn't get your card up for 185.
No, I didn't. Sarah, I was looking at your slide 11 on where you briefly discussed fleet certifications. I was up at CARB about a month ago and talking with their enforcement people, among others. And at that time, it's a little better than around, or something like 7,500 trucks still to certify. But my concern there is that I'm not sure what South Coast is doing here in this area, but CARB, their enforcement folks, they intend to cite vehicles that aren't certified after a certain date. But from a small business perspective, I didn't do a survey. I did a lot of discussions and telephone conversations with some of my members who rely on freight forwarders, deliveries and everything like that. None of them call, or when they're making a call for a truck to pick up someone from the ports or from a warehouse, to verify or to even ask, is your carrier certified? But CARB made it very clear that they would cite the requester as well. And, one that strikes to me the tone of unfairness to it, but it certainly would be unfair if both of your agencies don't really be aggressive in informing the business community, and I mean small businesses particularly, of their potential liability if they don't do that. Because as I say, the furniture industry and people who get auto parts and what have you, my metal finishers, none of them do that. They just, I need a truck and, for something like this. And so,
Yeah, so
it's a concern.
I get that. There's obviously a lot of details that we're still figuring out with this, and there may not be a valid concept for across all maybe it works in warehouses, maybe it doesn't. We have to figure that part out, and that's part of the work we're doing to better understand the business relationships and the contracts and how that all works together. The concept we had is that it's effectively a voluntary fleet certification program. And then the requirement would be then on the warehouse or the facility-based measure subject that they contract with fleets that have voluntarily participated in this program. So, but again, there's a lot of details within that we have to sort out, and we want to make sure that we're not sideways with additional requirements as well, because you don't want to sort of layer on multiple requirements on particular entities too.
But Bill, I think you're talking more about on the enforcement end of existing regulations that ARB has.
Well, the truck and bus rule.
Truck and bus rule, right, the retrofit rule and all that stuff. They, PM filters and all that. There's a lot of, estimated 30% non-compliance with that.
Something like that.
So you can understand why ARB is kind of thinking, how do we do enforcement to actually get
and it's
people
not voluntary on their standpoint.
Yeah,
that's right.
But you bring up a really good point.
Yeah.
If the people who are letting the contracts or using those trucks or contracting out to have someone move things for them are going to be held liable for it, they really do need a heads up so they don't get caught unaware. I mean, if it's a new initiative by ARB to do enforcement.
Things get pretty hectic in a small business, without adding that on there. Oops, I've forgotten now, all of a sudden I've got it. I'm afoul of one or both agencies here for not doing that.
Right. I think what we're talking about here is a little different from that, so.
That's right. That's right. And again, still high level concept, still trying to learn what would work and what's feasible.
Okay. Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Where on the district's website is information relating to the indirect source rules, like PowerPoints from working group meetings and that sort of thing?
We do have a website for that, so I've been on it.
You have to dig.
You have to dig.
go to plans, air quality management plan, and then maybe one below that, and finally you'll see under air quality management plan, there's facility-based.
Facility-based measures.
That's right, yeah.
I think if you search, you might find it,
Yeah.
We'll see.
Other
It's gonna be a test of the search, but we'll see how long it takes me.
Oh, yeah. Well, don't look for indirect source rule, look for facility-based measures, because it would be, yeah. It'd be too obvious to actually try it, so.
I know, because I was just looking for it.
We did have a question that came up on Friday about our legal authority to move forward, and I think Barbara's here to talk about that a bit, because it would be helpful to have some real clarity around that issue, and I had a whole host of other things I want to talk about, but Barbara, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so Sarah mentioned towards the end of her discussion a legal issue that kind of comes up late in the analysis, which is harmonization with other federal regulatory requirements. So I'm going to back up and start at the beginning, which is the state and federal structure for regulating mobile sources. Under state law, the California Air Resources Board has the primary authority to regulate motor vehicles, except as provided by statute. The Air District does not have that authority. Both the Air District and the Air Resources Board under state law have the authority to regulate other mobile sources, such as construction equipment, etc. However, that's where the federal requirements get into play. There is a provision of the Federal Clean Air Act that for many, many decades has preempted.
Is it just a hearing board member's car, not one of ours, Mark?
The owner of the blue Tesla.
No, there's a red Tesla and a white Tesla, I think, out there, but yeah.
Some days there's.
I didn't see a blue one.
So the federal statute preempts state and local governments from establishing what is called emission standards for motor vehicles. That's been in the law for decades. In the 1990 amendments, that preemption was extended to other mobile sources. So with the exception of new locomotives and certain farm and construction equipment, the Air Resources Board is allowed to set emission standards with what we call a waiver or approval from EPA. District, however, does not have that ability. But when you get to indirect sources, under state law, we specifically have the authority to establish requirements to reduce or mitigate emissions from indirect sources. That's 40716 of the Health and Safety Code. Indirect sources not defined in state law, but it is defined in the Federal Clean Air Act in Section 110, and it basically means a source that attracts mobile sources. And many years ago, the Attorney General had written an opinion which described these types of sources as being non-vehicular, which probably means that even absent a specific statute, the Air District would have authority over indirect sources. So it came up in the board meeting, is indirect source rule really just a mobile source standard in disguise? And that question was addressed by the Ninth Circuit in 2010 with regard to an indirect source rule adopted by the San Joaquin Valley Air District. And that applied to new development. It applied to both the operational emissions, which were primarily motor vehicles, as well as construction emissions, which were primarily non-road engines. And that specific argument was raised in that case, which was that this is really a regulation of non-road engines and therefore should be preempted under the provisions of the Clean Air Act, Section 209. And the Ninth Circuit said no, the Clean Air Act contemplates that you would have the ability at a local level to adopt indirect source rules. As long as it's really an indirect source rule, then it's not preempted by the Clean Air Act. And some of the points that the court looked at to determine that this was really an indirect source rule was that it applied specifically to the facility or site and not to the mobile sources or the vehicles themselves. That it set emission reduction targets for the site rather than a specific tailpipe emission level. For example, in the San Joaquin rule, the requirement was to reduce your NOx emissions and PM emissions by a given percentage below what they would be under business as usual. And the court, the lower court, the federal district court that looked at this also, in that case it was mentioned that you could actually meet these standards by other measures other than setting a tailpipe standard, and therefore that was additional argument why it wasn't preempted. So, so far the San Joaquin district is ahead of the game on indirect source rules. Their rule requires you to reduce your emissions by X% or pay the district a mitigation fee, which they then use to reduce emissions from other sources. Our Rule 2202 regarding employee commute reduction, which also has several options for facility compliance, is another example of indirect source rule. So the kinds of sources that we are talking about in the facility-based measures are all sources which attract mobile sources and therefore could be subject to an indirect source rule. So the Clean Air Act preemption should not be an issue. What is a potential issue is other federal statutes, most notably, and this is what Sarah was talking about, in the area of railroads, we have the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act, which generally preempts state and local regulation of rail operations. The Federal Aviation Administration Authorization Act, which not only deals with airports, but oddly enough, applies to motor carriers or truckers. And that preempts state and local regulation of, quote, the prices, routes, and services of air and motor carrier operation. So there's a lot of litigation under both of these statutes, and the basic principle that is the takeaway for us that Sarah mentioned was that if the local agency has the rule approved by EPA into the state implementation plan, then it becomes federally enforceable. It's entitled to the dignity of a federal statute, and the courts must harmonize that measure, the Clean Air Act measure, with the other arguably preemptive statute. And that applies also under the Clean Water Act. There's Ninth Circuit precedent for both of those. So that's,
who does the harmonization, the courts or
well, that's an
whoever's
interesting
adopting
question,
the
is
regulation?
who gets to do it, because in the case of the Clean Water Act case, it didn't come up until after it was already approved, so it was the court that did it. In the case of our railroad situation, that'll be something that we'll have to figure out and hopefully come to an agreement with EPA as to how that's to be done. If not, we may have to just take our own position. Ultimately, it would be the courts, but whether EPA would undertake that themselves is another question. So that's what the reference was to. We would probably have to require harmonization before we could make most of our rules effective, unless they really don't affect operations at all. Potentially something like an inventory rule might not affect operations at all. So that's a longer explanation that you probably wanted, but at least it tried to cover state and federal landscape for you.
So it's prices, routes, and what else?
Services.
And services.
So this building is an indirect source?
Yes. I was thinking that when I was driving through the parking lot today.
That certainly is, it's more of an indirect service.
We have a pretty large fleet, although we probably have one of the cleanest fleets of anyone, I would assume, other than maybe Tesla. But their employees don't all drive. But anyway, okay. Questions for Barbara?
Quick question. The litigation, did it have any type of discussion as far as existing versus future sources, as far as legality that's been challenged?
The San Joaquin rule, it didn't come up because it applied only to new development. In principle, it shouldn't matter as long as it meets those requirements of applying to the site and, not imposing a direct tailpipe measure.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering, in the future, are there additional sources that you'll be looking into, indirect sources that you'll be looking into regulating?
That's more a policy question.
I think we have our hands full at this point, but, I think again, to the earlier points of the need to be able to make significant progress on reducing NOx emissions, we'll have to evaluate where we are depending on how much we get out of this crop.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fairly significant indirect sources that we're leaving off the table at this point, potentially significant ones. But that's, like you said, got our hands full with what we're trying to do. I found the characterization of AQMD backstopping the ports rather interesting, since I didn't catch that on Friday, and for the last 10 years or so, we'd always talked about the ports backstopping themselves. So that's a quite different approach. And the incentive money, there was a point where you said, we want to make sure we don't interfere with incentive money, but that would only for the ports, and that would only be if we adopted regulations, right? I mean, there can be quote unquote requirements that are in an MOU, but those would not be seen as requirements in terms of making people ineligible.
That's the way that we see it. It is still a concern that the ports articulate, and I think it's probably the last thing we want to do is to do anything that would impede their ability to get funding. So it's just something that we keep in mind.
It's nice that we can agree on something, and that is they need a lot of funding. The development and redevelopment aspect, that's the one in which I find it kind of interesting that there's a lot of concerns being raised about that one, because that's the one in which I think we're the most vulnerable, because San Joaquin Valley is so clearly on point with a regulation that's been adopted, been put into the SIP, been tried in court, and if that's not a feasible measure at minimum, what they did, then I don't think anything, then nothing is. And I think that we have some legal vulnerability in terms of someone going to court under state law and saying it's a feasible measure, you can and should have done it a long time ago and didn't. So I'm a little concerned if we can't get that moving in some way, shape, or form to do at least as what San Joaquin Valley has done, if not more. And then I think there was a thing where you said about the economic study under the development and redevelopment project and approach. I guess the question is you're really not going to know unless you can figure out what require them to do, what the economic impacts are going to be, right? I mean,
but that was under the warehouse.
So similar to the warehouse, what we envision is that we would have, we haven't gone through the rulemaking process yet, but that we would have certain scenarios.
Okay, so in the warehouses, you said you come up with 10 scenarios. I mean, can you?
Something like that, right. And so
can we get to the point where we can think of 10 scenarios for development or redevelopment project?
We would think through some scenarios and model those. I think that's how we would approach it.
Yeah, that would be interesting. And I did mention on Friday, and still think it's really important that for these type of things, if we have a menu of what we're talking about, it becomes a different conversation, because then we can talk about whether they meet the criteria that Barbara talked about, whether they're appropriate, whether they're feasible, And until we get to the point where we have something specific to have a conversation about, it's the fuzziness around what these things actually look like, I think harms the quality of the conversation and the ability to figure out whether people really do object to it and for legitimate reasons or not, and whether we can or should be moving forward. I find it quite interesting that we talk about CEQA guidance issues. Mark could back me up on this, Barbara probably too. Our CEQA guidance is dated 1991 or 3? 3. Okay, well, that's a couple more years. CEQA has changed a little bit since 1993 in terms of my understanding. Why haven't we taken on the CEQA guidance since then? Oh, you're staring at Ian. Ian on the spot, huh?
I would just say one word: resources. Yeah.
Really, it's just.
Yeah. Yep.
I think it's
People
also,
are
it's
doing
probably,
secret documents.
it's probably worth saying, there have been a number of updates that have occurred on the SQL guidance. It hasn't been put into a nice handy book, but our LST guidance was a major update that was done. We have the CaliMod software, which is a state standard used everywhere on emission calculations, so.
So it's really not the 1990, I mean, we have updated parts and pieces, but we just haven't pulled it all together.
I don't think that's hampering anything because, you know, what really drives it is what did the last project do? And so if you're a new project coming in, you're looking at, okay, what did the last similar project?
Yeah.
So if you're a huge, you know, mixed use development, you're looking at 5 Point Newhall, and that's your SQL guideline, essentially. I mean, that's sort of an extreme example, but the fact that the agency has.
Are you saying that all new large development projects are going to be carbon neutral?
I don't think they're all going to be carbon neutral, but I think they're all, you know, looking at that and saying, okay, what portions of this are relevant to us? And
so in Newhall, all those commitments are in the SQL mitigation document?
Many of them are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. It does set a new standard then. I see what you're saying. I'm also curious. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me like we do comment on SQL documents, and people must look at the fact that it has a 1993 date on it when they're trying to figure out their SQL document and say, really, you know? But it's always, the last 11 years or so, I've always had a question as to why it's a 1993 document. How long ago was 1993? 25 years ago. Well, we should have a silver anniversary for our secret guidance.
Almost as old as the Clean Air Act.
Isn't it true within SQL, it's still ambiguous as to the thresholds that are exceeded for it to be a negative determination? Or has that been?
Well, each lead agency has discretion to establish its own significance thresholds for the various impacts. So you will find some variation up and down the state as you look at different lead agencies.
Right, but we have thresholds that we recommend.
Yes.
And then the lead agency makes that
And
decision.
that, one of the items that Ian was mentioning was the localized significance thresholds, which we have developed since the book was originally published. And a lot of local agencies do look at our significance thresholds for air quality impacts.
How often are they ignored?
Thresholds are almost universally used. Recommended mitigation.
Where do you locate those for that? On the website?
Yes, or
SQL Air Quality Handbook.
Okay, that's on there, okay.
Yeah, use the 1993 version. Okay, any other questions on indirect source rules? Anyone? No? Anyone on the phone? Members of the public? You're all clear on this? It's going to be a test next time we meet? Still didn't get a question out of them. All right. Subcommittee reports, 8A, freight sustainability. Who's doing that? Anyone? No one. We have no Dan McGivney representative here. Let me go to the brain bank and try to figure out what, if anything, is new on freight that I know of. ARB has, I think, they've gotten to the point of proposing to fund a bunch of projects. Or I know they published a list of all the proposed projects, which included a few that we're involved with. Very expensive, very cutting edge, some really interesting ones, and the ports are part of these proposals, including multi-port proposals that went forward. So some of that money from the climate investment money is going to be spent on some very forward-looking freight issues. I don't know when ARB is making that decision, though. I know that was going on. Anyone else have any information on freight issues? Okay. Small business considerations. We do have someone to ask about that. Bill?
Yeah, we continued our participation in discussions on some lingering issues relative to the reclaim transition and particularly resource review, BARC, and so on, and the landing rules. Some facilities want out on an expedited basis, some not so accelerated, and that continues to be an ongoing issue here with
You think
staff.
there's some facilities that want out before we figure out NSR?
Well, no. But there seems to be a presumption by staff that there are, everybody wants out, or certain, with the exception of some very large facilities, the smaller facilities want out, and that's not necessarily accurate. Whether you're talking about stranded assets or reduced flexibility, those things enter into that. So we continued our participation in discussions and meetings with the Metal Finishers Association over proposed amended rule 1469. We believe this is appropriate because while the proposed rule isn't duplicative or conflicting, it is certainly burdensome on a lot of businesses. And we hope that, I'm really not quite sure what happened Friday, where the ball is right now. I guess it's
back to Stationary Source Committee for more conversation.
Well, I guess I'm not quite sure what.
There was an assumption in that decision that more conversation would lead to something people would be more comfortable with. I don't think that's going to happen.
My sense was that between Dr. Parker and Dr. Burke, their recommendation was a meeting or a set of meetings with individual businesses to look at costs and before it gets to Stationary Source. As I say, I'm not quite sure what Stationary Source is going to do with this hot potato. And then finally, we've been reviewing and commenting on CARB's first and final draft of their clean air protection blueprint, as well as their...
No, there was a draft and then they did a final draft.
They did a final, but that was released about a week or a week and a half ago.
Right.
And then also we've...
Did you notice many changes? Because I didn't notice many changes.
Yes.
I didn't look at it that closely.
There are some subtle changes, but I saw some of my comments addressed in the final draft. I don't know if it was because of me or not, but anyway, they did address some of those or answered some of those. And then we're also been reviewing and commenting on CARB's proposed regulation for reporting criteria pollutants and toxic air contaminants. And haven't seen an amended proposed reg on that yet.
Is it getting too much into your item?
No.
Okay. Because he's got EJN 617 implementation now.
Well, you asked me what I was doing.
No. I just want to make sure Kurt's card didn't come up because you started talking about 617.
Sorry, Bill wants to take it.
That's my report.
Great, thanks, Bill.
I just had a comment on what Bill said about
You can
reclaim.
go right into EJN 617 implementation after that.
Yeah, and NSR. Up through July, there were a number of facilities that were champing at the bit to get reclaim, 2001, 2002 adopted and get them out of reclaim. And then at the August working group meeting, the staff came in with a revised proposal that said, oops, we don't know that we can handle folks exiting reclaim under the 4-ton per year exemption currently in Reg 13. In other words, if they move out of reclaim and they are allowed access then to the, for NSR purposes, the access to the 4-ton per year exemption,
right.
The staff was concerned, one, it might overtax the credits, and two, it could lead to an exceedance of the reclaim, the CEQA cap on funding out of that, the district's internal bank that was agreed to in the 13-15 litigation. So basically, they proposed anyone who leaves now would not have access to that 4 ton per year exemption anymore. Well, that, I mean, there are virtually no NOx PRCs in the open market, and those that are there are very expensive. And people at that point said we'd be crazy to exit because if we had to do an NSR event, we'd be screwed. So that is why there is this pressure from a number of us, all of us, that we need to get this NSR thing resolved, because until it is, people are not going to be leaving reclaim. So,
yeah.
So that just to clarify what the situation is,
Okay.
was.
All right, why don't you just go on with.
Okay, I did, the CARB staff has prepared its staff report on the recommendations for which communities will be subject to this initial round of the Clean Air Community Air Protection Plans program. And it's on their website. I found it last night. And
A lot easier than trying to find it on our website.
Yeah, you go to EJ and then you find the CAPP stuff, and it's right next to the final draft community air protection blueprint. It's a long report. I excerpted pretty much the executive summary, which identifies the communities that they are proposing for inclusion in this first go around. South Coast gets 3. That would include both air monitoring and emission reductions programs. They are, I mean, it's pretty unsurprising which ones they are. The Bay Area gets 2, one of which is air monitoring in Richmond, another is emission reduction program in West Oakland. Imperial County has one area. South Sacramento, Florin has one, which is only air monitoring. I'm familiar with that area. When I take my vacation every summer, we drive right through there, and it's there's a lot of warehousing and new residential development going on in that area. San Diego County has Barrio Logan, West National City, Logan Heights, Sherman Heights, which is probably the obvious case study for them. And then San Joaquin Valley has 2, Shafter and South Central Fresno, both of which involve air monitoring and emission reductions programs. So this will be going to the CARB board at the September meeting.
So have they decided how to provide the funding for this yet, or is that still one chunk of money that they haven't given out
Shortly
yet?
after they meet with communities, we anticipate that they
They'll
will
make a
make
decision.
that decision, and there's been some very good conversations, and we're expecting to get a significant amount, because
Enough to do 3 communities?
we're gonna have to make it work. So it depends on how much they can give us, but yes, we should be okay.
Okay. Is that it, Kurt?
That's it.
All right, thank you. David?
Yes. Adding on to Brian's reports, in preparation for the Global Climate Action Summit that starts today in the Bay Area, Governor Brown signed SB 100 that Brian talked about, but in addition to just the goal that's being changed to 100% clean energy goal for California, it does require the CPUC, CEC, and CARB to utilize existing programs to achieve this policy. So there'll be follow-up actions by those entities to achieve that goal, and also to go from a 50% renewable portfolio standard by 2030 to 60%. So it'll be a upping of that requirement as well. And the other document that was signed by the governor was Executive Order B5518, which is similar, that orders that a new statewide goal is established to achieve carbon neutrality as soon as possible and no later than 2045. So that was to kick off the Global Climate Action Summit. And then Dr. Lee had a nice set of graphs at the board meeting on Friday that came from the Climate Reality Project.
Yeah.
Which sounds like you're now trained.
I'm now trained, and I have the authority to use all 600 or so of Al Gore's slides if necessary, so
Use them
don't test
wisely.
me.
That is all.
I downloaded them. It was more than a gigabyte because there's a lot, there's a lot of video footage too. So yeah, I did download them. I had to get to those 2 that I wanted, so I had to download all 600 or so of them. There's a 10-minute version of the presentation that's probably, only 100 slides or something.
I was looking for more information on that event, and everything I Googled for is just the quote that Al Gore had about the current president that really came up.
Oh, really? Well, you had to apply for it, and then they put you through some kind of review, and you have to explain who you are and why you're qualified for it. There were a lot of interesting people there. There was 2,200 people, and I met a guy who quit his job to start a company to do net zero commercial productions. I mean, his partner was doing commercials and doing production commercials. So now he started this company and they got their first clients and he quit his job in March or something. So they're well on their way to making sure that all our new commercials that are filmed here are net zero. It was kind of interesting. People like that, or a lot of people. And when Al Gore went through the 2.5-hour presentation, I was fortunate because I was sitting up in the front, so I was really kind of right there on that day, and I had no idea that 2.5 hours had gone by. It's real. I mean, he's good at what he does. I mean, he just really, has got it down pat, and it was very interesting, very entertaining, enlightening, scary, but yeah, he's pretty damn persuasive. It really is. So some of the slides are just emotional appeal. Some of them are factual. He gets at it at a different angle, but makes a very good case of why we need to be taking this seriously, and especially pictures of Florida with an octopus in a parking lot on a sunny day, just because it was high tide. So there's things like that too, which you can't get out of your head.
Any of Santa Barbara with an octopus in front of his beachside mansion?
No, he didn't actually talk about his beachside mansion in Santa Barbara and the threats that rising ocean might pose to it. He did admit that he had at least previously had a financial interest in Proterra when he had them come up and talk about zero emission buses. Yeah, he didn't talk about that. They claimed to have offset all the carbon for everyone who traveled to the event, and there were people from lots of different countries.
Are we putting calamari for lunch?
They served all vegetarian food.
Oh, that's good.
They served all vegetarian food, and he said that he's been a vegetarian for the last 7 or 8 years, and that he doesn't talk about it because if people aren't ready for it, there's just no reason to have that conversation with them, which I thought was pretty insightful. But the trivial things, right? Those are the things you really retain, the trivia that he's been a vegetarian for a long time. He doesn't really talk about it.
Yeah, really badly to that sometimes.
What's that?
I said people react really badly to that sometimes.
Says the vegan.
Well, I mean, if you tell them how you eat a certain way, it's almost like telling them your political affiliation. It's strange.
Right, or your
Sometimes
religion or something.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah. That's exactly what he was saying. If people, if they're not ready to have that conversation, then don't. It's probably a good idea. So approach it carefully if you're going to have that conversation with people. But he did toss out some facts about the impacts of eating meat on climate. Yeah. You sticking to it too?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other things, David? That's on. All right. Questions, comments on the subcommittee reports? Members of the public? No one's waving their hand. No one on the phone. Reports to and from Stationary Source Committee. I assume Jill.
Yes. So we had an additional Stationary Source Committee meeting August 17th, because we were finding that each of the Stationary Source Committees, we kept running items over, so the committee members were kind enough to give us an extra Friday. So there are 3 items on that meeting. One was proposed amendments to Rule 1135, which is NOx from the electric generating facilities. There was a status report on Rig 13. This is our Twice a year we come in, this was the final determination, basically we're doing well and showing equivalency with state, federal news source review requirements, and we have adequate offsets projected for the future. And then the third item, which Dr.
Until
Logan
people got a
requested-
reclaim.
That's not included in the projection at the
Right,
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
We will have to take that into consideration, and hopefully that will change that picture. And then the other item was an update that Dr. Liu had requested on where we were looking at the under fire charbroilers and the status of some of the research. So those were the three items at the last Stationary Source Committee. The meeting that's coming up September 21st, we have three items on the agenda at this point. Proposed amendment, or proposed rule 1407.1, which has to do with toxic emissions from chromium alloy metal operations. And that's basically just a testing requirement. And then the proposed amendments to reclaim 2001 and 2002.
Melting operations.
What did I say?
You said
Chromium
metal.
alloy melting. Oh, you're right. Excuse me. Melting. Different. So the second item is the options for folks to opt out of reclaim for 2001 and 2002. And then there's also an item on there to look at the guidance document for test methods for the adhesive and sealant applications for Rule 1168. So that's coming to Stationary Source, and it's still an open question when we will go back to Stationary Source on Rule 1469.
You can't do it on the 21st because I'm going to miss that
Well,
committee meeting.
I think we're going to need
I'm gonna
more
be out of town.
time than that would
That's
allow
too bad.
anyway, so there's talk about whether we would do it at the October meeting or perhaps
I'm going to be
set
at
up
the
a
October
separate
meeting.
date.
Okay.
So stay tuned on that.
You would have 1469 at the, in downtown LA at the Clean Air Awards, would you?
No, it's not coming back. To the board, I think said by December.
Right, the board said by December, so that would be too soon and it would be too big of a discussion to have when the Clean Air Awards are going to start.
And I don't think it's at the Bonaventure, right? It's at a different hotel.
No, it's at a different hotel.
You're all invited.
Los Angeles Hotel,
Yes,
Yeah,
Los Angeles Hotel.
Which one is that?
across
It's
from
on
the World Trade
Figueroa.
Center on Fig.
LA Grand.
Oh,
LA Grand.
It's 333 South Figueroa.
okay, I know which one that is.
And then Jill.
That's good. My bus stop's right there.
What are you going to do at 1168?
It's the test method guidance,
Oh.
so it's just how the test methods can be done.
Is that
it has
yours,
nothing to do with
Rita? Did you cause that?
They're not doing much, so we're good.
That's the report I have.
Okay, any
At
questions?
least that's as related to us.
Any questions or other comments? Okay, other business, anything we didn't capture today on the agenda? Public comments for anything that was not on the agenda today? Yeah, last try. Okay, well, lunch is here. Despite Al Gore's position on eating meat, we're having steak and lobster again.
I didn't hear that part, it doesn't.
And our next meeting will be then adjourned, and our next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, November 14th here in CCA. So thank you very much, everyone on the phone. And we'll
Thank you.
next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.